I'm half Canadian and spent part of my childhood there, and hearing Americans talk about the country often left me unsure of how to respond. For many years, Americans and Europeans, especially those with left-leaning views, spoke about Canada as if it were some ideal land of comfort, a sort of progressive post-racial paradise. But I always knew that wasn't accurate. More recently, Canadians and Americans on the political right describe Canada as if it has transformed into a harsh, authoritarian state, which also isn't true. The debates around the trucker protests and Canada's overall response to the COVID pandemic reveal tensions that have existed in the country for a long time. Because of this, I think it's an appropriate moment to discuss a future possibility that both Americans and Canadians rarely consider: that there is a real chance Canada may not remain intact over the next several decades. This video explores the potential future of Canada and the scenarios that could lead to the end of the nation as we know it. Music Canada is often overlooked globally, yet it is a stable secondary power that has played a significant role in major historical events. Many of these moments are documented in the Magellan series Canada, The Story of Us. This documentary traces Canada's development, from its origins as a group of British colonies to its role in major modern conflicts like World War II and the Cold War. Watching the series provides insight into issues Canada faces today, while also highlighting the country's contributions to key moments in world history, including the World Wars. Mellon TV is a documentary streaming platform created by filmmakers, offering one of the strongest selections of historical documentaries and films. Their content covers everything, from ancient civilizations to current events, and from true crime to astronomy. Magellan works on nearly any device and streams in 4K HD at no extra cost. It's a great platform at an affordable price. I personally enjoy Magellan and the wide range of historical, scientific, and cultural documentaries they provide. With such variety, there's truly something for everyone. They're also offering a free 1-month trial for anyone who uses the link in the description. So visit Magellan TV and create your account today. Many international left-wing observers imagine Canada as a model of progressive politics, but that version of Canada doesn't really exist. Like any country, Canada has its own history, problems, and political compromises. To understand how Canada could potentially fracture, we need to examine the country's core challenges, its political structure, and how it currently operates. Only then can we see Canada realistically, rather than through the image it prefers to project. There are 3 essential political truths about Canada we need to understand. The first is its similarity to the United States. Anglo-Canada is, in many ways, an extension of the United States after the American Revolution. The Loyalists who rejected the American Revolution moved to Canada. Most of them came from the mid-Atlantic states, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, giving much of Anglo-Canada a cultural foundation similar to those regions. The cultural overlap between Canada and the United States is extremely close. Canadians speak the same language, eat similar food, attend similar churches, watch the same films, and the similarities continue in countless other ways. Each Canadian province often has more in common with the neighboring U.S. state than with other Canadian provinces, or even with different American regions. Genetically, Anglo-Canadians are essentially an extension of the northern United States, while American Southerners could be considered a distinct ethnic group. For example, the part of Canada where I lived, southern Ontario, was heavily settled by people from the region I'm originally from, southeastern Pennsylvania. As a result, I saw many of the same street names, building styles, and community layouts in both places. These cultural parallels have contributed to a major identity challenge for Canada: how to distinguish itself from the United States. Before 1960, this was largely done by emphasizing Canada's British heritage. But as the political influence of the Quebecois grew during the 1960s, Canadians needed a new way to define their national identity. Today, that distinction is often framed as being a more progressive alternative to America. This leads to one of the unusual features of Canada. Its nationalists tend to be urban and left-leaning, unlike most countries where nationalism is rural and conservative. This brings us to Canada's second major geopolitical issue: its intense geographic divisions. 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border, and the country stretches in a long horizontal line, making the development of a centralized national core nearly impossible. Each province has distinct cultures, priorities, and political interests. To summarize from west to east, British Columbia resembles California, Alberta is comparable to Texas, Manitoba and Saskatchewan are similar to Nebraska or South Dakota, Ontario mirrors states like New York or Ohio, Quebec stands on its own, and the maritime provinces resemble New England. Meanwhile, Canada's far north regions, such as Yukon and Nunavut, have very small populations, often composed of indigenous communities. Canada's geography reinforces these divisions. The massive Rocky Mountains isolate British Columbia, the vast Canadian Shield separates the plains from Ontario, and large stretches of uninhabited forest distance the Maritimes from the rest of the country. Put simply, Canada is geographically split east to west by the Canadian Shield. Quebec represents the third major challenge. Roughly 1/4 of Canada's population speaks French, and outside of Quebec, there is very little interaction between French and English communities. In all my years living in Ontario, I encountered only one French speaker outside Quebec. Most Anglo-Canadians do not speak French at all. The Québécois function as a distinct nation, and they behave accordingly. Their strong nationalism is partly rooted in centuries of discrimination and political marginalization under English dominance, leading them to push for various cultural and political demands. The Québécois have pushed for numerous concessions from the Anglo-led federal government. They frequently make symbolic demands, such as insisting that French be the only official language in Quebec or requiring French language use across the entire country, even in regions where almost no one speaks it. Quebec has threatened independence several times, coming surprisingly close in the 1960s, 1980s, and 1990s. One of the few things many non-Canadians know about Canadian history is that the country has come close to internal conflict multiple times in the 20th century. To manage these tensions, the federal government has essentially offered Quebec financial incentives to remain in the country, transferring substantial funds from other provinces. The combination of Quebec's demands and Canada's deep geographic divisions means the country functions as a loose set of regional alliances that hold it together. For example, Alberta and Quebec often align against Ontario, while at other times Ontario and Quebec unite against the western provinces. These alliances matter far more than most people realize. In 1980, when Quebec nearly voted to secede, the Prairie provinces stated they would prefer joining the United States rather than stay in a country dominated by Ontario. The recurring Quebec issue was managed through what became known as the Laurentian Alliance, which formed in the 1980s and 1990s under the leadership of Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father. This alliance mainly united Ontario and Quebec, with the maritime provinces loosely attached, and collectively opposed the interests of Western Canada. Ontario, especially Toronto and its surrounding suburbs, and Quebec together hold over half of Canada's population. Both regions lean socially liberal, forming a consistent coalition against the more conservative Western provinces. Meanwhile, the Maritimes, which have experienced economic decline and deindustrialization, remain part of the coalition largely through federal support and welfare transfers. To simplify a complex history, the political and economic divide between Eastern and Western Canada dates back to the mid-19th century. It has long been characterized by resentment and unequal relations, with the heavily populated, industrial East often dominating the resource-producing West. Geographic barriers only reinforce this separation. When examining Canada's political leadership and ruling class, the influence of the Laurentian Compromise is clear. The alliance of left-leaning regions has kept Canadian politics positioned to the left of the United States. Canada's Conservative Party remains relatively moderate compared with the U.S. Republican Party and is often to the left of many of its own voters. With a national consensus tilted leftward, the Liberal Party maintains its strength by relying on a core base in major urban and suburban centers like Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. This demographic, urban, suburban, and socially progressive, drives both Liberal Party success and much of modern Canadian nationalism. For many Canadians, supporting a strongly conservative movement would feel like abandoning the country's self-defined progressive mission. Another key point is that nationalism in both the United States and Canada is largely driven by the middle class. However, the two nations developed from very different founding principles, which shaped the political and cultural differences seen today. The Loyalists who shaped Canada and the more radical revolutionaries who founded the United States created two very different national identities. As a result, American nationalism is fundamentally right-leaning and centered on ideas of liberty, while Canadian nationalism is largely left-leaning and grounded in order. This is why actions taken by Canadian nationalists or political leaders often appear, from an American viewpoint, to undermine individual freedoms. However, from a Canadian perspective more similar to Europe, these actions are usually framed as efforts to establish stability and preserve social cohesion. This contrast was especially visible in Trudeau's response to the trucker protests against vaccine mandates. His administration used measures such as freezing bank accounts, invoking emergency powers, and dismantling protest camps. To many, this episode symbolized the Laurentian liberal establishment taking extraordinary steps to maintain authority over the conservative Western regions where the movement began. The current moment, in which the Trudeau government is facing widespread criticism, offers a useful window into the broader decline of the Canadian political order. For those who haven't followed recent events, the Canadian left has been widely accused of overreaching its authority in the past few years. Examples include arresting the leader of a major right-wing opposition party during an outdoor political rally for what was labeled maskless behavior, or allowing border officials to place travelers into government-run quarantine facilities if their self-isolation plans were deemed unacceptable. Without trial, Canada's Parliament passed a law requiring the use of individuals' preferred pronouns and attempted to introduce legislation that would restrict free expression among Canadian YouTubers. The government also maintained strict lockdowns long after more than 70% of the population had been vaccinated. These issues come on top of earlier controversies involving the political elite, such as the SNC-Lavalin affair, the We Charity scandal, and a prime minister known for championing political correctness despite past participation in blackface and other forms of cultural insensitivity. Political correctness in Canada is often far more intense than in the United States, especially on matters involving Indigenous communities. In the early 20th century, Canada ran a system of government schools intended to assimilate Indigenous children. When evidence from one of these schools resurfaced, the country entered a period of national mourning. Church bells rang, schools held ceremonies, and public institutions paused, even before a full investigation had taken place. The irony is striking. Canada historically had some of the best relations with Indigenous peoples of any country in the Americas. Only one major Indigenous conflict occurred, and colonization was comparatively more peaceful. In the United States, where the government repeatedly violated treaties and committed large-scale atrocities, such intense self-criticism might be more expected. Yet Canada has embraced it most strongly. I remember my sister's college, the University of Toronto, often considered the country's top university, making extensive efforts to honor. At public events, the University of Toronto would routinely acknowledge the Haudenosaunee as the true owners of the land. In reality, the Huron were the original inhabitants of the Toronto area, and the Haudenosaunee, better known as the Iroquois, displaced them and carried out what many historians describe as genocide during the Beaver Wars of the late 17th century. By contrast, British settlement in the region was comparatively peaceful and carried out through treaties, largely with the Iroquois acting as allies. Canada's cultural climate today reflects a kind of postmodern consensus. A clear example is the Wet'suwet'en pipeline dispute, in which democratically elected tribal councils approved the pipeline, yet activists attempted to shut it down by claiming that only the hereditary chiefs represented the true authority of the nation. They argued that elected Indigenous governments were merely products of Canadian colonial structures and therefore illegitimate. The historical irony, however, is that the system of hereditary chiefs itself was shaped by European influence, and before colonization many of these societies did not have formalized governing systems at all. Within Canada's modern political class, there is a growing belief that Indigenous groups should operate according to their own authority, separate from federal law, because Canada itself is viewed as a colonial project and therefore lacking legitimacy. Justin Trudeau and members of his circle have expressed views suggesting Canada has no real national identity, no unified set of values, and must continuously rely on immigration to define itself. They envision a uniquely postmodern state, one detached from ethnicity or traditional nationhood, something rarely seen in history except perhaps in large empires controlled by strong centralized elites, such as Austria-Hungary or the Mughal Empire. This ideological direction makes more sense when considering that Canada's political elite are legally required to be bilingual, a trait held by less than 20% of the population. They must operate comfortably within both French and English cultural spheres, which naturally creates a small, insulated leadership class. A close friend of mine, the Canadian political commentator J.J. McCullough, who also contributed to this script, made a video explaining how Canada's historical goals were to keep the French in, the Americans out, and Indigenous peoples under firm control. His argument is that Canada has failed in all three areas and is now losing any clear national identity. Viewed this way, the increasingly radical behavior of the political elite becomes more understandable. When those in power feel their legitimacy is weak, they often act unpredictably or aggressively in order to maintain control. This perspective also highlights the postmodern approach of Canada's leadership. If they lean too heavily on any single national identity, the entire system could fracture. Anglo-Canadian nationalism ultimately leads toward closer integration with the United States, while French-Canadian nationalism points toward Quebec independence. Either path would dissolve the idea of a unified Canada. This is likely why the government places such intense emphasis on Indigenous nationalism. With Indigenous peoples making up less than 5% of the population, their political identity can be incorporated into the ruling coalition without threatening the system. If 95% of Canadians become disconnected from their historic identities and the remaining 5% are integrated into the elite's framework, the ruling class can maintain its balance. What I'm trying to express here is that the current governing coalition in Canada is gradually losing its legitimacy, largely due to corruption. In my video about social justice, I concluded that the movement would eventually collapse over the coming decades, and a similar decline would unfold within Canada's political left. The issue, however, is that the left is also the force holding the country together. It feels almost strange to say that Canadian elites are abusing their power because, from a historical perspective, their shortcomings seem relatively mild. This is not comparable to British India, which allowed tens of millions to die in famines without intervention, or to modern-day Myanmar, which has carried out genocide against the Rohingya and runs a military dictatorship that subjects minorities like the Karen and Shan to a form of state-imposed servitude. Still, the role of the state is to serve the nation. Regardless of intentions, a system fails if it imposes Confucian values or multiculturalism in ways that do not align with the nation's core interests. As my friend JJ often says, a polite, orderly, and friendly Canadian form of totalitarianism is still a form of totalitarianism. Another major factor that is rarely discussed is how Canada has benefited from recent good fortune, specifically, how it avoided the wave of populism seen in the United States and Europe. Many assume this stability reflects some inherently virtuous aspect of the Canadian people. In reality, Canada's political calm has been tied closely to high global resource prices. Canada, at its foundation, operates much like a colonial economy, relying heavily on selling raw materials to global markets. By coincidence, the past few decades brought rapid economic expansion in the developing world, which kept resource prices elevated. We see similar patterns in Latin America, Australia, and New Zealand, countries strengthened by resource booms, while Europe and America struggled more with deindustrialization. In resource-dependent countries, downturns often follow declines in prices, especially as China's growth slows. This shift contributed to rising left-leaning, big government politics in Canada, Latin America, and Australia, as citizens increasingly relied on government support to maintain living standards established during the high-price era. Canada's delayed entry into populist politics helps explain why the country has not yet experienced a strong anti-immigrant backlash, unlike the US and Europe. Having lived in both Canada and the United States, I can say that the idea Canadians are inherently more tolerant or open-minded simply isn't accurate. The main difference is that Canada experienced longer periods of economic growth, which prevented immigrants from being perceived as competing for limited resources. Still, given the sheer scale of immigration, it is hard to imagine this issue not becoming a major political topic. For instance, the Greater Toronto Area is now majority immigrant, and Vancouver's population is about 40% immigrant. However, as my broader predictions suggest, it seems likely that the world economy, The global economy and political landscape are likely to face major challenges over the next few decades, which could slow worldwide growth and eventually bring down resource prices. The only real exception would be a large-scale war, which could drive resource prices dramatically higher. Now, imagine a Canada where the current left-wing leadership loses credibility due to ongoing corruption and poor judgment. In this scenario, a strong right-wing populist movement, similar to Trump in the US or Marine Le Pen in France, emerges with a powerful nativist message. Historically, the leadership of the Canadian Conservative Party has been extremely moderate and centrist, which has limited its momentum. A recent example of this trend was the removal of Erin O'Toole, who was dismissed partly because he was viewed as too bland and lacked appeal. One important point to recognize about Canada is that the country could fracture without extreme pressure. The 20th century was relatively easy for Canada, yet Quebec still came close to separating several times. Demographic shifts, however, are setting up a far more difficult century ahead. This brings us to demographics, which always play a decisive role. Canada's demographic reality is striking. The eastern provinces are aging rapidly, with birth rates and median ages similar to Western Europe. Meanwhile, Western Canada remains one of the youngest regions in the developed world and continues to grow. As I've repeated many times on this channel, demographics shape political outcomes, and nations with shrinking, aging populations face bleak prospects. An older society lacks the resources to start new businesses, fund military efforts, or raise enough children, eventually becoming a financial drain on itself. Japan already provides an early example of this trend. Even today, wealthier and faster-growing Western Canada sends financial support and subsidies to the eastern provinces. This imbalance will worsen, especially considering the deep political divide in the prairie regions, where conservatives regularly receive more than 90% of the vote. Alberta, a major oil-producing province, depends heavily on the United States as its main market. A story that highlights this tension is the conflict surrounding the Standing Rock pipeline. Alberta, unable to transport oil westward due to a trade dispute with British Columbia, attempted to route the pipeline through Texas. However, the proposed route crossed land ceded to the Lakota in 1876, turning the project into a symbolic issue for the American left, which ultimately blocked its construction. There are several long-term historical cycles influenced by demographic and economic patterns, complex and difficult to forecast. But both the Turchin and Strauss, how models predict a U.S. golden age around the middle of the century. Historically, every time the United States entered a golden age, it expanded its territory, as seen in the early 1800s and the 1940s. If those patterns repeat, the possibility of the U.S. seeking to annex additional territory becomes part of the discussion. It wouldn't be unusual for the United States to expand again, especially since it is still a relatively young nation and won't experience the same level of demographic aging that much of the world will face. This potential rise could occur at the same time Eastern Canada experiences economic decline and demographic collapse. A major reason many Canadians resist the idea of joining the U.S. today is the perception that America is politically unstable. But if the U.S. entered a new golden age, it would be logical for the prairie provinces to align with a country that shares their conservative values and serves as their main market for oil and grain. In that situation, joining the U.S. would likely offer them better long-term economic security. As independent states, they would have limited bargaining power with the Americans, but as U.S. states, they could secure far more favorable terms for their resources. That is one scenario. Another possibility is that mounting internal stress within Canada could lead Quebec to declare independence. Either outcome would effectively dissolve the network of regional interests and political compromises that hold Canada together today. If the prairie provinces joined the U.S., British Columbia would become geographically isolated from the remaining parts of Canada, likely pushing it toward independence. British Columbia is highly left-leaning, arguably the most left-leaning region in North America, with socialist parties frequently leading the province. Joining the United States would be politically incompatible. Independence, however, could be workable, as the province is already oriented toward Asia economically and culturally. Vancouver is about 40% Asian, and a significant share of its trade is tied to the Pacific region. Vancouver, along with the rest of British Columbia, could function effectively as a city-state-style nation. On the opposite side of the country, a Quebec exit would leave the maritime provinces cut off from central Canada. These provinces lean left politically but lack the strong provincial identity found in British Columbia or Ontario that would make U.S. annexation unthinkable. Their trade connection with the U.S. is not especially deep, so several outcomes are possible. They could join an Ontario-centered federation, form a small nation dependent on Ontario, or, if the U.S. is in a prosperous period, choose to join the United States. This leaves Ontario, which would likely retain the Arctic territories, except for the Yukon, which would probably join the U.S. due to its geographic connection to Alaska. Ontario represents the core of Canadian left-wing nationalism and would be unwilling to join the U.S. for cultural and political reasons. Yet, its central position in North America gives it room to operate similarly to small European states, remaining independent while integrating economically. Ontario could structure its economy around providing services or industries that complement the American system, such as specialized manufacturing, lower taxes, or permissive regulatory environments. Still, regardless of their formal independence, regions like Ontario, Quebec, or British Columbia would remain economically, politically, and militarily dependent on the United States due to geography and trade realities. In practical terms, these regions would have no real option other than functioning as dependent states. Looking at the broader picture, Canada is unlikely to survive intact over the coming centuries without some form of absorption into the United States. It lacks the long-term foundations that help nations endure, such as strong geographic barriers, a unified national identity, a strong military tradition, or a crucial role in global power dynamics. In reality, the only thing that has prevented U.S. annexation so far, speaking bluntly, is geopolitical inertia. To be clear, this is simply one scenario that could unfold. There is no certainty that it will happen or that it is even the most probable outcome. Despite its issues, Canada remains one of the world's most stable countries and exists within a very secure region. For that reason, the chances of Canada reaching the 22nd century as a functioning nation are still quite strong. However, I wanted to explore this possibility because it is a perspective rarely discussed. That's the end of the analysis. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for future content. You can also check out my Pillar, Pearl, or Patreon pages, the 3PS. As always, thank you for watching, and have a great day.